I'm Jay, and welcome to today's episode of Fairly Odd Therapy, a place where we take a look at fairy tales and mythological stories through a slightly different viewpoint. We take themes and elements in these stories and we apply them to addiction recovery efforts. Today, we want to talk about known threats and unknown threats. And to illustrate that, we're going to look at the story of Red Riding Hood. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Red Riding Hood, it's a story about a little girl who was given a cloak by her grandmother, and she wore it every day, and she became known as Red Riding Hood. And we'll call her Red for the rest of this video. Red's mother, one day, puts together a basket. She's asking Red to deliver this to her grandmother. But she warns her, hey, on your way to your grandmother's house, stay on the path, and don't forget, there's a wolf out there. Red says okay, and she takes off. So as she's going along and she's in the woods, lo and behold, here comes the wolf. And the wolf is asking, hey Red, where you going? I'm going to my grandmother's house. What you got in the basket? Well, you see, my grandmother is sick, and these things are going to help my grandmother get better. Where does your grandmother stay? Well, she stays at the house at the end of the path by the 3 oak trees. The wolf tells Red, don't you think that it'd be nice maybe if she had some flowers or something? Red thinks about it for a minute. She says, yeah, I think that would be nice. So Red begins to pick flowers. Meanwhile, the wolf goes to grandmother's house. He gets to grandmother's house. He knocks on the door, and grandmother, being ill, asks, who is it? The wolf replies, it's Red Riding Hood. Grandmother says, come on in. The wolf enters and eats the grandmother. But while he's waiting for Red to show up, he puts on grandmother's nightgown, cap, and all of that. Well, Red has picked enough flowers by now to feel like she has enough to make her grandmother happy, and she gets back onto the path and goes to her grandmother's house. When she gets there, she finds the door open, which is kind of weird for her, but she goes in and she sees someone who should be her grandmother lying in her grandmother's bed. And she starts asking those familiar questions. Grandma, what big eyes you have? Grandma, what big hands you have? Grandma, what big ears you have? Grandma, what big teeth you have? And the wolf has a response for all of this. Well, my eyes are big, the better to see you with. My ears are big, it's the better to hear you with. My hands are big, it's better to hold you. And my mouth is big, the better to eat you with. And the wolf eats Red Riding Hood. Well, after eating both the grandmother and Red Riding Hood, the wolf goes to sleep. And in this version of the story, the wolf is snoring. And that snoring gets the attention of a woodsman who happens to be passing by. And the woodsman knows that the old lady is there and decides to check in on her because that's not a sound he's familiar with coming from that particular house. So he goes in and he finds the wolf there. And he thinks maybe the wolf has done something to the grandmother. So he goes to dispose of the wolf, but he thinks maybe, the wolf ate the grandmother for some reason. I don't know why. I didn't write this book. But he decides to cut the wolf open. And as he's cutting, he sees the red cloak, and he knows right away something is wrong. So he continues to cut. Out pops Red Riding Hood. Out pops Grandma. So before the wolf wakes up, they fill his stomach with stones, and they sew him back up. Once the wolf wakes up, he tries to get away, but he dies because the stones are in his stomach. So, what does that have to do with known threats and unknown threats? Well, if we're looking from the perspective of Red Riding Hood, the mother told her there are threats out there. The wolf is out there. Don't get distracted. And Red, knowing that there's a wolf out there, encounters the wolf and interacts with the wolf anyway. That's a known threat. Okay, those are things that we know will hinder recovery efforts. People, places, and things. So there are certain people that when you are interacting with them will increase the likelihood of you re-engaging in your addictive behavior. When you are in certain places, there are certain places that you go to that increase the likelihood of you re-engaging in addictive behavior. There are certain things like sounds, smells, certain tastes, emotions that when they are activated will increase the likelihood of you engaging in an addictive behavior. So those are your known threats. But the wolf also represents unknown threats. Now remember, the wolf actually goes to grandma's house. And it's at that time that he assumes the persona of someone who should be safe to Red Riding Hood. When Red arrives, she expects to see her grandmother. She sees someone that is wearing her grandmother's clothing, and she interacts. It should be grandma. Grandma's been sick. She's not feeling her, self. But the warnings or the red flags are there. Red sees that, hey, what big ears you have. But the wolf explains that away. That's the better to hear you with. What big hands you have. Again, the wolf explains that away. It's the better to hug you. What big eyes you have. It's the better to see you with. And then lastly, what big mouth or what big teeth you have. And it's the better to eat you with. And it's at that point that the wolf eats Red Riding Hood. So those red flags are there, but the wolf explains those red flags away. The wolf in grandmother's clothing is an unknown threat. There are individuals that we encounter, that we have in our lives that should be safe spaces. And we see those red flags and we allow them to explain them away because that person should be safe. And it's not until it's too late that we see that maybe this person wasn't who we thought they were. And in the story, those red flags are explained away. But in life, we also do that. We see when someone is acting a little differently than normal, but we allow them to explain the behavior away, or we explain the behavior away because we want them to be a safe space. And then lastly, you have the woodsman. So the woodsman comes along and he saves Red Riding Hood and Grandma from the wolf. Well, the woodsman is representative of the true support system, a true support system, which is someone or some organization that is there to actually help you. They see that you are in need of help and they're willing to help you out of that circumstance. So with that, we close this episode of Fairly Odd Therapy. And we hope you to have a great day.
If you like this video and want to see more, make sure to click the subscribe and like buttons and turn on notifications.